continue the discussion around contract killings now and the increase of guns and ammunition in our societies means that more gun violence and potential massacres. According to a report by the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, if you are a candidate standing for political office, a whistleblower in possession of an explosive secret, or at least an activist campaigning for your community, you are at risk of losing your life. Let's chat more now about what this report says exactly and, more importantly, the frequency of these contract killings. And we speak to Jenni Irish. She is from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Jenni, good morning to you and thank you very much for your time. Let's start with the frequency of targeted killings, or what would plainly be known as assassinations. How frequent or prevalent are they in South Africa specifically?
I think we've had a history of targeted killings in this country, largely political. But what we're seeing is that currently they are on the increase, particularly in provinces like KwaZulu-Natal. And it's no longer just political killings that we're talking about. We're talking about them taking place in the taxi industry, organized crime, in the interpersonal space. And so they've become a lot more frequent across the board. And that you have a pool of highly sophisticated, what's often called izinkabi or hitmen, that actually are prepared to hire themselves out to carry out these hits.
And that particular word you've just used, izinkabi or hired hitmen, do you think that an illicit economy has subsequently been created, particularly in the province of KwaZulu-Natal?
Absolutely. So if you look at their origin, they predominantly existed in the taxi industry, and now they are beginning to hone their skills across the board. So they have become a pool of people that can be hired out as and when you require them.
Why is it that law enforcement is failing to thwart this then?
I think that there are a number of factors. I think that many of these hitmen operate quite brazenly. And that is a question mark as to how they operate so brazenly. Very often they are heavily armed, and they have just the right weapons and ammunition for the right types of crime. So you will see in some instances they will use semi-automatic firearms. In other instances they will use handguns that are easy to disguise, etc. I think that the sheer number of people and that it is a growing pool makes it quite difficult for law enforcement to control.
Jenni, I've got to ask you this question because we're talking about this issue of contract killings because of the incident that occurred at the weekend. But it's not as though it doesn't happen every other day in South Africa. The understanding, in fact, is that in one day, at least 70 people are killed in South Africa, and in all probability it's through the use of a gun. In KZN, if we focus the attention there, there was a commission of inquiry into political killings specifically, and these were targeted political activists. That commission would have come up with recommendations for the government there to start implementing. When you see things like this, such as what occurred this past weekend, before that, I think a week before that, in Wamashu, there was a mass killing in that township that took place there. It doesn't stop. Do you think that that commission of inquiry was a worthless exercise?
I think that if you look at some of the findings of that commission of inquiry, I think it was quite in depth, and they did release a number of quite significant findings, not all of which have been implemented. But I think that if we're looking at violence, and particularly in a province like KwaZulu-Natal, where over the last 10 years we've seen the murder rate increase by 68% over a 10-year period, we need to start looking at a number of different factors, one of which is the access and availability of firearms and ammunition in the province.
And so the Minister of Police, alongside his Commissioner of the Police, what is it that they should be doing or should have done by now?
Well, I think there are a number of things that need to be done. Obviously, we need to look at our investigative capacity to be able to deal with growing organized crime in the country. We need to look at a comprehensive strategy that begins to address that. When it comes to firearms, I think there are a number of factors. I think that if you look at where are our firearms coming from in this country, historically, our firearms came from firearms smuggled across the border from other conflict zones and from conflict that had taken place in this country. What we're finding is that increasingly the firearms being used in the commission of criminal acts are much newer firearms coming from three particular sources. The first is from civilians who license firearms that are lost and stolen. The second is from the police themselves, and that is an incredibly concerning factor. Those would be both police-issue firearms and firearms that are seized or handed in during amnesties and then stolen out of the police stations. And then the third category is from government themselves. And we're saying that while there may be moves to actually tighten up control over civilian firearms, it's not going to be enough if we don't also tighten up control over state firearms and firearms under the jurisdiction of the state, and that is police and army firearms and firearms belonging to other state departments.
Jenny, then there is the understanding, particularly from experts like yourself, that says the effects of targeted killings go far beyond the pulling of the trigger. Talk to us about that. What is the impact of this on society?
So I think that what if you look at how those, I mean, somebody's got to commission the killing. There's got to be a pool of readily available hitmen to carry out the hits. Those hitmen that carry out the hits have got to have access to the necessary tools of the trade, whether that's vehicles, getaway vehicles, firearms, etc., etc. When it comes to the harm and the impact of this, I think that we're seeing it in a whole lot of different sectors of society. That if you look at what's happening in the taxi industry, it's becoming a very prevalent form of how to resolve conflict, is taking people out. If one looks at the issue of the political killings and the whistleblowers, it creates serious fear amongst people to actually who are prepared to then come forward and become whistleblowers, or who are prepared to stand up as honest, just political figures in the country. So I think it has a whole lot of different factors, and it's also becoming very easy for people to hire hitmen for revenge and interpersonal killings. I think it's become just a lot easier for people to deal with people they have a problem with by using these hitmen, and that is quite a scary concept.
Perhaps as a final question to you, Jenny, South Africa is, as I mentioned earlier, your organization doesn't just look at South Africa, but it monitors east and the southern tip of the continent. There is a mention of Mozambique, there is Rwanda, and there is Kenya there that are mentioned as perhaps countries that experience this kind of thing. How high up the scale does South Africa rank when it comes to contracted killings?
I think that we look at 45 countries across the world, and South Africa is increasing its rating in terms of where it stands in terms of these kinds of killings. In places like Kenya, you have a tremendous number of politically related killings, etc. But I think what distinguishes South Africa is a very diverse market for contract killings, which places us quite high on the spectrum.
Wow. Now that is scary. Jenni Irish, let me thank you very much for your time. She is with the organization Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Now that is a very, very scary reality for us here in South Africa.